Let's have ourselves a morning cup of coffee and take a look at the ever-evolving cut list for the New York Football Giants, the NFL at large, and what lies ahead of the 4 p.m. cut down deadline. Next. Yes, friend. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, live on a Tuesday. Where, of course, we are your host over here, Adam Arwick, breaking down the Brooklyn Nets and the Locked On Nets podcast with my boy Doug Norrie. And yonder there, the healthy, wealthy, and wise, the seasoned generational ticket holder, Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are we, sir?
It's days like today that make it wildly confusing being a Giant fan and following the team as much as you do, because there's just a flurry of activity. Not only do you have names going out, you have names being released from other teams. You're like, ooh, that could work. Maybe we should try that guy. That guy could fit. And you're like, how do I make this like, I feel like it's like, A Beautiful Mind, where like the chalkboard goes up, you're trying to like put the numbers together, and it's wildly confusing right now, Adam.
You go Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe. I go Hangover with Zach Galifianakis, right? With a black eye, and it's just disheveled, a suit on. It all doesn't add up. A little bit of Rain Man thrown in, circa Dustin Hoffman. Yeah, man. And what's funny about it, we're going to highlight all the cuts that have already rolled in this morning. We know there was some, I think 7 got released yesterday after we had recorded a couple of names that we were disappointed to see going. But the funny thing, to your point, is like you get attached to some names, and we know that's what happens. You start watching these guys preseason, but it's this it's two minds, because on the one hand you're like, shoot, player X got released by the Giants, but when you see another name come up, you go, although if we could get our hands on that guy, all of a sudden I don't care that we lost our 6th wide receiver. We could be getting a starting safety, a starting cornerback, based on what your team needs and how it looks. That being the case, though, let's hit me with the list here, right? Because we are up to, I think you had Art Stapleton, within the last 10 minutes or so the Giants have gotten down to 66, so still another 13 to go, and it's probably a rolling list. But where do we stand now with the wave that came in this morning of additional cuts? Some that could be a little bit disappointing for Giants fans.
Yeah, so just to get the timing down of everything, also, we're recording this morning. Like we said, Art just put out that we're at roughly 66 with the 7 that came out yesterday, coupled with the 7 that were basically released this morning. We're slowly getting down there. What Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen said is that they will get down to the 53 number before practice at 1 o'clock. So they don't want to have a bunch of guys out there that aren't going to make the team. It feels kind of disingenuous to have everybody running around out there. So right before the media availability, they'll come on and explain the decisions that they've made. So good news is we should have some clarity, unless something crazy happens. Right around 1 o'clock, we'll know. But the latest ones of people that have been released by the Giants, Ryder Anderson, defensive lineman, just broke about 10 minutes ago. CJ Board, wide receiver / kick returner. He's someone that maybe we'll talk about going back to the practice squad. Alex Bachman, leader in receptions in the preseason with 19, no longer with the team.
Leader on the waiver cut list.
Yeah. Jalen Moore, the wide receiver that was claimed recently from the Baltimore Ravens, feels like he just didn't have enough time.
There you go. So he went out the door too. This is what happened. We're talking preseason, pre-show meeting. We're saying like, this guy goes, and it makes you think about guys that get brought in late in the process, but also gone as well.
Yes. Jamil Douglas, the offensive lineman, who was a veteran that felt like he was, filling in some spots, clearly was just doing that for the team. Darren Evans, the cornerback undrafted out of LSU, who, got a lot of playing time in the preseason, but, apparently that's a little bit of a crowded room, and they're trying to decide who they're going to keep. And lastly, our sweet, sweet, sweet prince, Jashaun Corbin, was released. And so I know a lot of other Giant fans kind of picked up on the Jashaun train as we went through all of this, hoping to put him back onto the practice squad, because we really do think that he could fill in. So that is the immediate 6-7-ish names that have been released this morning, with about 13 more to go in the next 4 or 5 hours. Adam, what are your initial thoughts by the names that have been released?
Yeah, well, well, I'll get to the Bachman one in a second because I think that's like a bigger conversation just around the preseason and training camp in general. The Jay Corbin one, I'd like to think I don't know whether he was destined to make it or not make it. I'll be curious to see if one more gets released there or if they go with 4 at the running back position, right? That like kind of we didn't see any of them essentially when it comes to preseason games, but he's worked on special teams too. So is Gary Bright. Well, we know that looks like Antonio Williams is as safe as anybody in that running back group. But I'm curious about that. Is there another running back that's going to get cut and you're hoping to sneak Corbin over to the practice squad and maybe, maybe who would it be though? Like Breed is not going to the practice squad, right? To be a straight cut. Maybe Brightwell, you think you can get him back there too? I don't know if they'll do anything there. Do you think they'll just go with 4 to start the season in the running back group?
Well, one of the things that Art Stapleton and Dan Duggan keep mentioning is that Dable and Joe Shane keep talking about they put a premium on people that can play special teams. Now, you may say, well, that sounds disingenuous considering CJ Board just got released.
But by the way, too, just a quick pause. They put a premium on it, but what has been the most disappointing aspect of preseason so far for the Giants? Like the special teams
exactly.
has been terrible. It's like we put a premium on these guys. And we know it's because we're not very good there. That's why we're trying to keep as many of them as possible.
It's like a team that says we want to run the ball first and they average 1 yard per carry. You're like, that's not really the mission that you guys are really fulfilling here. So, but the CJ Board piece is interesting. I think that one gives us a little bit of a nugget. I saw a couple people mentioning this online with him being, released, hoping to get him back on the practice squad, coupled with Alex Bachman. It actually kind of means a couple things to me. One, it puts Richie James and David Sills in the driver's seat to make the roster with Richie James potentially doing some of the kick returns unless something crazy happens on the waiver wire. And the second piece is CJ Board was also a gunner on punts. And they said that over the last preseason game or two, Zion Gilbert, undrafted cornerback out of FAU, has been in that role and he's been playing with the first team. So if they basically said, oh, like for like, we like him, but also we need help at the cornerback position. Don't be surprised, and this could age very poorly over the next couple hours, but don't be surprised if Zion Gilbert is a name that you end up seeing saying, oh, I'm surprised he made the roster.
Yeah, but that, like, to your point too, right? So in the new regime, so now you get a guy in Gilbert. We saw obviously Darren Evans. You try to watch these preseason games. I said it's a mixed bag, but for an undrafted prospect you brought in, thought maybe he could stick around a little bit. Maybe he's a practice squad guy. We'll see. But cornerback or secondary being an area of need, right? So CJ Board from the holdover regime, yes, he's a gunner, but we think that the wide receiver room has a lot of talent in there. If you can replace him with a position that you could also utilize on a game day basis, I think it makes more sense. I don't know, CJ Board wise, maybe he said all these things. We're running this thing live, so you can get on the comments and bring it up there. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, what do you got?
Breaking from Ian Rappaport, the Giants have cut Quincy Roche. So big domino to fall for the Giants because he clearly was one of those guys that in that edge rushing room was going to potentially make the roster. So seeing him gone means a couple things to me, Adam. Initially, it means that I think that bodes well for the health of Thibodeau and Azeez Ojulari, knowing that we may not need depth for week one. One of them will at least be out there, but it means that, maybe O'Shane Ximenez or Ellison Smith is going to have a bigger role on this team, depending on how, the 53 shakes out.
That is, well, and not surprising, but I guess this is confirmation. So you keep interrupting if more cuts come here because Andy does a far better job of the multitasking, being over on Twitter, monitoring what's going on, etc. As we'll go ahead and throw this one up over on Twitter live as well because Quincy Roche. So here's a guy that every indication over the course of the offseason was this is not the same player as far as how he's being valued or looked at from the organization as it was last year. Like you didn't see the flashes. Some of the potential is there. Do you think that there's any world where he makes it through and the Giants try to get him back? I mean, he's a second year player, right? We kind of got hyped on him last season because the Giants didn't have anybody out there to play. So you go and you take a fly on a guy that gets released by the Steelers, comes in, shows a little something, but he's still a young player. He's still an unproven player. I wonder how the league looks at him. Like, right, rewind this timeline. Last year, the team that drafted him released him in the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Giants were a desperate team looking for talent. So is still relatively a back-end roster guy and more of a deep depth piece that we didn't realize until you go through a draft class. You get a guy like Thibodeau, you see some other players, even like an O'Shane Ximenez, who's been around the league with the Giants and has a skill set. All of a sudden you go, yeah, maybe he's a guy that needs more time to develop, needs more time to figure out what he's going to be. I wonder if another team will take a look at him.
Well, just remember, Quincy Roche was someone that the Giants claimed that another team released. So while we saw some of the flashes, we also didn't have Kayvon Thibodeau on the roster. We also had an injured Ellerson Smith. And with a new regime, when everyone starts fresh, that it's not like the Giants had invested heavily. And it's also like the sunken cost, fallacy.
Yeah.
Like the Giants had him on the roster. They had a chance to evaluate him. And they said, we like what Ellerson Smith gives us potentially, or O'Shane Ximenez, or Jihad Ward, or whatever it may be. So ultimately, Roche, while I think he will get claimed by someone else because the talent is there, everyone mentioned that in Wink's new system, it felt like it was just a little bit off with his size and his attributes. It didn't really have the same, gravitas that it did under Patrick Graham, where he could just pin back and get to the quarterback.
And I think too, like, we know that the linebacking group is thin here for the Giants, and we know that Wink Martindale, like, you want a lot of that. Go back to second preseason game. It's like this little footnote piece where you have Fox out there standing on the sideline, right, has that big blow up hit. But they've been talking about it a lot, about how defensively there's going to be times where it's far less about how many secondary players you have on the field in the back end, and more about all these linebackers that are going to be trying to come in and lay wood and have range and have athleticism. And the Giants don't have a ton of them right now. So, Quincy Roche, a guy off the edge, your point, skill set, yes, athleticism, maybe, listen, by NFL standards, let's not mince words about athleticism when we talk about professional sports, but just not quite the perfect fit for them. We got some people in the comments that are obviously bringing up, just confirmation that Alex Bachman, he was released this morning, cut this morning. I'll go back to this again, because there are two guys here. One guy is the converted quarterback in David Sills, who for now the last couple of seasons has, as you said, I think last year in the offseason, followed Daniel Jones around like a puppy dog, like all around the country, just looking to catch passes from and looking to develop. He currently, in this moment, is a part of this roster, and we think is going to be a part of the 53-man roster. Alex Bachman, as you said, has this fantastic preseason. He's catching balls left, right, and center. But just like you're not going to overhype Davis Webb for his performance against third and fourth string or guys that aren't even going to be on rosters in the NFL, do you look at Alex Bachman and say, yeah, he's better than fourth string guys, but it doesn't mean that he's ready to compete against number ones or even number twos at the NFL. And he's 26, going to be 27 years old. I'll be curious if he gets back through to the practice squad. He's just been a part of this team for a few seasons.
It just feels like a numbers game with Bachman right now too, where there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, you saw it with CJ Board leaving the Giants, being released. The issue, and I saw this pointed out, I believe it was by Dan Duggan online, don't expect that there has to be a decision made with Darius Slayton by 4 p.m. today. They could presumably keep him on the roster, show other teams that he is valuable to the Giants, and then work out a trade before week 1 of the NFL season. So it doesn't feel like the 53 is a deadline for Darius Slayton, knowing if the Giants were to outright release him, he would easily, sign on with another team tomorrow. So there's no, if you see Darius Slayton make it through the 53, that doesn't really mean too much, but it does for guys like Alex Bachman, because that means Slayton would be taking a roster spot that maybe he could have snuck in on.
Yeah, shout out to Tyrone Bowman. I think this sums it up. Old school 4-3 DM. We're looking for freakish athletes when we're talking about Quincy Roche, and that's the facts of it underneath Wink Martindale. I have other thoughts just about the defensive side of the ball and what's going to happen here for the Giants as they prepare for the season. Something that we'll tap back into. You mentioned Darius Slayton. Chenault from the Jacksonville Jaguars. He went on the move to the Carolina Panthers yesterday, and I think you're right. Like, the value of any of these guys on this list, Alex Bachman. Listen, there's not a big threat that someone's going to snatch him up. And if they do, they do. Whereas Darius Slayton, you're willing to take this thing as far as you need to, understanding that he is an established talent and has proven himself at the highest possible level. I'll be curious. I would prefer that the Giants get a trade, done here before the deadline so that you can preserve whatever roster spot you may be looking at. I'll be fascinated to see how far they're willing to take it, because ultimately, you can just release him when the roster spot is needed. But boy, you'd like to hear that there's interest. And it seems like teams have been. And Chenault, that feels relative, right? A talent, has done some things, isn't necessarily the cream of the crop. You don't know what he's going to be utilized as. You get a little bit deeper at his position, and all of a sudden he's expendable.
Yeah, well, and keep this in mind too about Darius Slayton. We don't want to replicate what happened last season, where we traded B.J. Hill for Billy Price, and all of a sudden, like we thought we were shoring up the interior line. Billy Price is nowhere to be found anymore. Didn't really perform for the Giants. B.J. Hill gets a 3-year, $30 million deal for the Super Bowl runner-ups in the Cincinnati Bengals, and he seems very happy to be leaving New York. We don't want to have the same thing happen where Darius Slayton gets traded for a guy that basically doesn't even make the roster, and then he puts up 800 yards and 8 touchdowns for someone else and gets a big contract, and they're like, the Giants can't evaluate talent. So, right. keep in mind with Laviska Shenault as well. He got traded for a 6th round pick and a 7th round pick. It's not very much. He was a 2nd round draft pick. He had more promise and upside, I think, than Darius Slayton did. The market says that there's interest for these types of wide receivers, but if you get anything for Darius Slayton, it's not going to be something like a 3rd round pick. So, like, Giant fans need to temper expectations on what you can actually get for someone like Darius Slayton.
Let's kick this one out of the way here. Blue City Empire Sports said, do you think the Giants would trade Darius Slayton to the Jets for Mims? No, there's no, and Andy actually kind of outlined it right there. The value chart doesn't line up there. Denzel Mims, whatever he has not been, again, the Jets will try to go to the trade market and say, like, how do we improve this team? I don't think a lot of teams, Jets included, who are very deep at the wide receiver position, by the way, like they have a lot of veteran talent there. They drafted more young talent. They looking at Darius Slayton and saying, where does he slot in? You're going to bring him in to be your 5th or 6th wide receiver in that group, and then we'll get rid of the 6th or 7th wide receiver in our group. Probably not a lot of impetus there for the Jets to really make that move. But the other reason why you hold on to Darius Slayton here as long as possible is all these cuts happen, and then waiver claims start going in, and maybe teams miss out on getting some of the talent they want to, right? Everybody else, we're here talking about the choice that the Giants have to make to prepare themselves for waiver claims. This is what every other team in the league is doing right now, right? They're looking at their roster and saying, where's the risk reward? Who can we get through to the practice squad? And what if we happen to lose one of those players that we wanted to sneak through and maybe utilize going into the regular season and bring them back up? Maybe Darius Slayton becomes a little more attractive, but I think you hit it on the head there. 6th and 7th round pick, like you got to turn back around and say that's what it's going to look like here for the Giants. I think that they're just hoping to get some kind of value for a player that you maybe ultimately don't plan to keep around. I'd be fascinated how long they'll go with this to see.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is like trading a wide receiver for a wide receiver doesn't really make sense for the Giants. Like, we already have the surplus of wide receiver. We need the cap space to address other areas of need, like cornerback, potentially safety. There's so many other places that the reallocation of funds would make sense. Doesn't make sense to bring in an underperforming wide receiver that is on contract through next season for the Giants, and it doesn't make sense likewise for the Jets. It's like Denzel Mims is buried on the depth chart for a reason because they went out and acquired a bunch of wide receivers over the last 2 years. That doesn't make sense for the Giants. Now, Adam, we're still waiting to hear about more of the cuts that are going to be coming out for the Giants. It's all happening in real time, as we just mentioned. But there are players being released. There's the 2 sides of the coin. Other teams are having guys released. The Kansas City Chiefs just released Josh Gordon, wide receiver Josh Gordon. Philip Lindsay just got released. Danny Shelton just got released, a name familiar with the Giants.
Wow.
And I know that there's 2 other guys that have been released that everyone seems to be talking about in Giants circles. One being OJ Howard, which I think you were wanted to chat about a little bit.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting, right? He gets released, and you even mentioned Josh Gordon there, who had other issues beyond the football field, but that's a name that everybody recognizes. OJ Howard is a name that everyone recognizes. Has he ever lived up to the hype of when he came out in the draft? No, but I'm very curious to see how the Giants approach the tight end position. On paper, you say, well, you have Daniel Bellinger, and finally in that 3rd preseason game gets hit on that sideline catch, and he shows a little bit of that athleticism, that burst. Like, we like him. We love him. We want more of him. But how are you going to fill out that room? And is a player like, do the Giants think they need someone, and OJ Howard need not be the name, right? But do they need somebody that they think has the athleticism, has the size to maybe just get utilized? I need 1 or 2 catches a game from you. I just need to be able to create a different look offensively. Or with all the depth at wide receiver and the talent at the running back room, where essentially over the course of the season, we've been seeing everybody top to bottom show they're capable of catching, being a catcher out of the backfield, being utilized in all phases. do the Giants are they reducing the need to take a flyer on an OJ Howard or to spend money on someone that has a little bit stronger of a track record or a more confident resume? Right? Eric Ebron has been out there waiting for somebody. Jared Cook, all these names are going to be out there. But where do you think that the Giants ultimately want to land? I thought they needed to go get one. I'm not so sure it matters as much anymore.
You listen. The name OJ Howard seems to be resonating with Giant fans. They're like, wow, it's a good good tight end.
And coming out of Buffalo as well.
Right, exactly. Has familiarity with the team. What I will say is this. OJ Howard had a bunch of money guaranteed, Adam. OJ Howard signed a 1-year, $3.5 million deal with the Buffalo Bills, got $1.25 million in signing bonus, and $3 million guaranteed, right? Like 3.195 guaranteed. They basically guaranteed almost his whole entire contract to bring him in, and they decided to bring in, this is all via Spot Track, so I just want to make sure that that's where the numbers are coming from. But think about how poorly he had to perform in Buffalo for them to just eat $3 million in dead cap of what they just signed him for. And the Giants, who have no cap space whatsoever, are like, that seems like an interesting signing for us. I personally don't see it. He's obviously had injuries coming out of Alabama. We thought he was going to be the next big thing. It just hasn't panned out. He has had 15 touchdowns over 5 years, had a couple years where he had over 500 yards. To be honest with you, it feels like some of his athleticism has been zapped. And I think, some people in the comments are saying it. We want athletes. We want guys that you can shape and mold into the system that you have. It feels like he's already 27, coming off multiple injuries, and just got cut for a team that guaranteed him money.
Who knows? Maybe that was the apple of Joe Shane's eye, when he was back there, then they brought him in, they let him go. I was thinking about that, not take OJ Howard, and I want to get to your player that's been on the minds of Giants fans as well and connected to the defensive side of the football. But do you think that a part of it is too, with the potential concerns around Kenny Golladay, is it also like whatever you bring in could be a tight end, could be a wide receiver? It's a safeguarding this idea of you have the quick, young, shifty talents that you like. Now you wonder, how do we make sure that we have some of those bigger bodies for the red zone? Obviously, you can look at a David Sills, like you could look inside the Giants locker room. But do you think that plays a factor? Because I'm a little bit, I'm like, hey, like, just what if we need the jump ball guys? But I also don't want to diminish the value of Mike Kafka and Brian Dable of saying, like, listen, if you can't, that's what I've always felt. If you can't scheme for success, regardless of having monster receivers or having power running backs, like, that's on you then if you can't get it done.
Well, so this is a delicate balance that, Adam, you and I have talked about for a while. Do you just go with just pure talent everywhere and just figure it out later? I do think that that's the way that I lean, because you just can't teach talent. Like, some guys can jump higher, run faster, do things that other players can't do. So that's where I lean. What I will say is somewhere like the safety room, where it is extremely thin, we don't have very much veteran leadership there. They tried to bring Andrew Adams back to see if he could kind of conjure that up for the Giants. It didn't really work out with him. You saw Yusuf Corker get released. We're talking about Nate Metters.
It's the practice squad, baby. Come on.
Yeah, we're talking about Nate Metters potentially making it. You have Xavier McKinney, Julian Love, and you hope that Dane Belton can potentially be there early on the season from this broken collarbone. Obviously, the Ravens have just released Tony Jefferson, veteran safety, about 30 years old, played many years under Wink Martindale, but has not played very much football over the last couple of years because of injuries. I do wonder if he's an interesting name on a veteran minimum deal to have a guy that knows Wink's system in the back, being able to teach guys like Love and McKinney and say, like, if nothing else, I'm veteran depth for you, but also know the system and can help these guys get up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'm not against it, but again, like you said, like, veteran experience in teaching the system. Listen, what was the whole entire preseason and training camp for? Like, and I'll specifically say, if this isn't about Dane Belton, who's a rookie, that would make sense. This isn't about Julian Love, who's experienced and is not necessarily the, shorter, long-term, biggest component of this. Xavier McKinney is the man, right? Like, now you can say veteran leadership back end of it, but you have to show me what the rest of this roster looks like and convince me that I didn't lose or waste a roster spot on a more valuable player at a more valuable position over having veteran experience. Like, I'll take, over the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season, some lumps from some of the guys in the safety room, if that were to happen. And then, by the way, if they haven't figured it out by week 3 or 4, that's a bigger problem anyway, right? Like all the veteran leadership in the world isn't going to necessarily change whether or not they can do it. And we all agree Xavier McKinney is the man. He's going to be the man for the Giants. And I think this year more than ever, we're going to see the full arsenal of what this kid can do for you on the back end of this defense. So I'm not against it. I need to see the hierarchy of what this looks like and what you maybe sacrifice to bring in a veteran like that.
Yeah, and listen, there's other veterans that are out there. Duke Johnson just got released from the Buffalo Bills, but like again,
I always Duke Johnson. We're not talking about for the Giants, but I always liked Duke Johnson. I never thought he got a fair shake over his career.
But the thing is, like, and especially just for the Giants' perspective, it's like we just released Jay Corbin. Do we really need to bring in Duke Johnson? Like, we already are pretty stacked up. You know, I see some of the comments, Blue City Empire Sports saying Antonio Williams is going to be on this Giants roster. I firmly believe that he's solidified himself a roster spot with his ability to catch the ball out of the backfield. He does feel like a guy that they brought over from Buffalo that's going to be here on this roster. I don't think there was any doubt between Adam and I whether or not he was going to make it after what he's done this preseason. I think we were saying it's between Breida, Brightwell, and Jayshon for only two of those players can potentially make the roster. We've already seen Jayshon be released. It depends on whether or not the Giants go with 3 running backs or 4 if both Breida and Gary Brightwell make the roster.
No, for sure. I'll throw out another name here for you. You talk about the linebacker room, the linebacker edge room. Remember a little familiar fit? His name, Devin Kennard. Remember the guy? He was released by the Arizona Cardinals. He was very successful. I'm trying to look up to see if that was, now he's 31 years old. So obviously we're not talking about a spring chicken here. I'm trying to find out what his contract was and whether or not this could have come down to, a money decision and if he could catch on somewhere else. There's something like,
it wasn't about, so Devin Kennard got released more because they went out and they drafted multiple linebackers at the position, and they like how they started moving during camp. Kennard can still play. It's great, but they're kind of moving on a youth movement in the linebacking position. So it was a little, he was like kind of the odd man out because of the, from the age when they wanted to go a little bit younger.
Do you take a flyer on, I'm saying a guy like that, let's put it into the bag of, he can play, can play a little bit of versatility there, but more specifically, let's just say an older guy, right? Like just a guy who's in his 30s, right? Like what is the margin for you? Because we talk about this a lot. What is the margin for you of, we need to be better, we need to get more depth, we need to have talent on the roster? Are you willing to look at guys that are 30, 31, 32 years old, if they're not specifically, let's say, tied to Wink Martindale, to Mike Kafka, or to Brian Dable? Those are the guys you feel more comfortable with?
So for me, it's very, very simple. If we have established players at certain positions behind them, I want guys that we can coach, train, and like have yet to fulfill their full promise of talent so that we can potentially have them come in and flourish. I don't want veterans that are 33, 34 years old necessarily being behind those guys because there's no upside to it, right? Like, okay, you could plug a hole for an injury here or there. Kennard is actually an interesting one, though, because the Giants are a little bit thin at the linebacking position, so he may have the ability to get on the field sooner rather than later. If it means one of these veterans can get on the field, I like it because that means like we desperately need that help. If you're saying like we just want one of these guys to back up one of these players, then I'm not as interested. I'd rather develop some younger, cheaper talent on the roster.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at his stats there. Combined 24 tackles, 19 the year prior. Maybe go back to 2019 Lions after he finished. He played 2 years with the Lions. That was kind of the peak of his powers there, right? 46. So just shy of 100 combined tackles over those 2 seasons and 14 sacks, 7 in each one of those years. His time with Arizona did not look nearly the same. And by the way, just from a standpoint like that, when we talk about veteran players at any position, like that's what you're also looking at. Like the Giants did way too much of this, bringing in veteran talent that was right on the precipice of starting to fall off the cliff. And then you went, but you know what though? Let's ride it all the way to the bottom, right? Like you have to avoid that as well, I think, when you're looking at some of these players to bring in. Like you said, listen, there's going to be some talent that's going to be veteran stopgaps, but ultimately I just can't risk bringing in a guy that I have to waste 2 or 3 weeks, reps for a younger player, just to confirm, oh, this guy's shot. And you mentioned Danny Shot before. I mean, that seemed like the most egregious one in recent memory where you're like, Come on. What are we doing here, especially on the heels of the other players that you lost across that defensive front?
Yeah, I see some of the comments. Timothy just put one up. Should the Giants trade Darius Slayton and a 2023
Oh, Timmy, yeah. Well,
first rounder?
Timmy is a big trade machine guy. He likes to throw out a lot of things, likes to have a lot of bold predictions. I don't always necessarily think, Tim, that you're quite aligned there, but you can knock this one down if you want, Andy.
Well, no, I think, obviously Jalen Johnson's 23 years old. He was
Sold.
selected in the second round by the Bears. Would be an interesting one for the Giants, but a first round pick for the Giants would be really, really tough here because we don't even know where that pick's going to land. Are we saying that Jalen Johnson could be a top? Is he the same value as a top 5 pick next year?
Yeah.
Like, what type of cornerback could you get that's younger, cheaper, and has more upside next year if the Giants, fail out? So for me, this just feels like way too much for the Giants to give. If you said Darius Slayton and a 4th round pick, maybe I'm more interested, but obviously the Bears wouldn't do that. Doesn't feel like the Giants and the Bears are compatible in terms of giving up one of their young, promising cornerbacks in that spot.
No, of course. So it's 9:45. We're going to come back in again, as Andy said at the top, 1:00 before the Giants get into their practice. We'll hear from Brian Dable. We'll get some official, insights as to why they made the choices that they did. And a lot of them are probably going to be like Alex Bachman, as example, Jayshawn Corbin, even Yusuf Corker from yesterday. I think a lot of the commentary, and it doesn't have to apply to all of them, is going to be, yeah, we really like him, hoping he gets through, right? And then on the back end of cut down day, you'll also hear, and then waiver claims tomorrow on Wednesday, you'll hear from Joe Shane. And they'll ask, maybe, say Jayshawn Corbin gets picked up, they'll talk about, we wish we could have. Well, we got another fresh one?
No. So I just want to keep one more thing in mind as we get closer to 1:00. When we come back in, we'll see the clarity from a couple of these different roster moves the Giants have to make. But Jason over the cat also said something that people should be thinking about. He said, "Don't be surprised by some veteran cuts today. Sometimes they are just to have a roster spot to pass a player to IR." Or to try to delay releasing another player they really like. So, there may be veterans where it's like, hey, we can release you and re-sign you and have a handshake agreement kind of deal just because we need the roster spot when the 53 needs to be solidified at 4:00. So we can make other transactional moves and then we can bring you back immediately. And so you got to have a lot of faith and trust in the agent and the player and the team as well to be able to do that. But there are some of these veterans that will re-sign come 4:30. And, a lot of people are already speculating Tony Jefferson might be one of those guys where they released him already to say, hey, we know you want to potentially retire as a Raven. Give us that roster spot. We'll move someone else to IR. You can be back here in 3 hours.
And by the way, Shane Lemieux is being talked about as far as what's going to happen with him. This is about getting to a point, and then he goes to IR potentially to start the season, and you try to get a little bit of flexibility there. So all these things are happening. And on top of which, any of the names that we're talking about, you'll have to get a sense of where is the league when it comes to the value of these players, because we can sit here and say, hey, this player got cut, that guy's available, that guy's not going to be on the roster. There's still a price point for all of this, right? And the Giants are making their roster moves. Still have to wait and see where their money is, where the price point is going to be on some of these guys. And then, as we said before at the top, a guy like Darius Slayton, somebody is going to have to, you're going to have to figure out something when it comes to, is his 2.5 million worth X when it comes to something else? How long can you carry that money before you feel like, yes, we need to get ourselves over to a little more flexible space there, as I get a little bit distracted as we try to block some unpleasant language over in the chat, in the comments. We made it almost through, Andy. We did a nice little solid 30 minutes here. Almost made it through without anything inappropriate.
Yeah, but as we said at the top, we wanted to let everyone know, it sounds like Joe Shane and Daboll have said that they want to get all of these transactions done before the players get out to practice. He doesn't want anyone having to practice that isn't going to make the roster. Then they'll be available for the media to be able to ask the questions about why they made the decisions that they did. So we'll have some clarity at 1:00. As we mentioned, there may be some of these moves where it's to place people on IR. Maybe Shane Lemieux makes the roster and goes to the PUP list if he's not able to play originally, and they re-sign one of these guys that they've released. But there's a lot still to go on between now and then. So we'll have to see, ultimately what happens between now and 1:00. Tons of things. There's at least 13 moves the Giants are going to make, and we'll be back in to make sure everyone can hear what those moves are.
And at the end of the day, friends, one of the reasons why you can afford to make these moves and decisions, again, other teams take it all the way to the 4 p.m. deadline because they have too much talent and there's really difficult decisions and guys that will be signed by other teams if you release them, the Giants can afford to be a little bit on the front foot around this stuff, right? They can make decisions that set them up to be as aggressive as possible as you move towards waiver claims. Or to your point, like, I think it's just smart as well. You get these guys, if you're trying to get them, sneak them through to the practice squad, fine. If you're trying to give them the best leg up to start communicating with other teams, because these guys are going to be on the move potentially, but also you want to go, like, we got practice, right? We know we have X players that are going to be here, at least in the short term. We want to make sure that we go onto the field with those guys and don't risk potentially taking an injury to somebody and then just complicating the decisions that you're going to make. So that being the case, guys, we'll just take one last look here. Do you guys see Fox? Fox is an interesting one. Out the door here. Do you think that Timon Fox is making it through?
No, I don't, unfortunately. No, I mean,
no.
We're running out of time, Adam. Just like Joe Shane is, we are too. The short answer is no. I'd love to see him on the practice squad because he would be a guy that we could develop. But there's just not enough room at the inn right now for Tom and Fox. But a name to look out for.
All right. We will, of course, be back in, as we said, updating later today. Another live running on YouTube, maybe running also over on Twitter. Over to YouTube, subscribe to the channel, man. Get the feed, get in the comments. We want you to be a part of the ride for us on the One Giant podcast. Get the podcast wherever you get those needs fulfilled on those, what they call feeds in the business. And until not even next time, just until later today, as Andy Makowitz always wants, needs, and nay, demands the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.